good morning, good afternoon, and my name is Cindy Forsyth, and I work for the Huntington Society of Canada. And we're just going to wait a few minutes while we wait for attendees to log on. We've got about a quarter of the people logging on, so we'll just take a few minutes and wait until everybody is secured on the system. Okay, if you've just joined us, welcome to the Huntington Society of Canada and N2's clinical trial webinar. We are just waiting for people to log on at the moment. So it is about 1 minute past the time that we said we'd start. So we'll give it another 4 minutes for people to log on. Could people just check in with the chat room and just let us know if your audio is working? So just type in yes under the chat so we can just test everything out. Dawn, I'm just trying to check the chat room. Do you see that people are responding saying they can hear us?
I haven't received any yet, Cindy.
Okay. I'm going to type in a message into chat. Please confirm you can hear the audio. So if you could just confirm that you can hear us, we would just want to make sure that we're ready to go when people have logged in. Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. Okay, Dawn, how do you want to handle this?
So all of the organizers and panelists can hear us, but it seems that the attendees cannot.
So we have 25 people who have signed on so far. Of the 25 people that have signed on, can you please confirm in the chat room to the right of your screen if you can hear us?
Oh, there's a number of people that have said that they can, Cindy. It's actually under the questions section.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So we've got a number of people who have
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, we'll wait just a couple more minutes and then we will get started.
And
Okay. Welcome to the Huntington Society of Canada and N2's clinical trial webinar. My name is Cindy Forsyth and I work for the Huntington Society of Canada. One of the fundamental pillars of the Huntington Society of Canada's strategic plan is to create a national Huntington disease clinical trial strategy. We've been working on this strategy since 2012, partnering with researchers, clinicians, families to ensure our community understands the benefits and the risks of participating in clinical trials. One of the partners that we have collaborated with is N2, the Networks of Networks, a national organization which helps to share best practices in clinical trial research and clinical trials. Their goal is to make sure that people know that clinical research and clinical trials may be an option for them. Thank you for joining us. We are delighted to host you today. I'm so pleased to have with us today Dr. Oksana Sirkowski, Professor of Medicine, Medical Genetics, and Pediatrics at the Topin Research Chair in Neurology and the Director of the Clinical Genetics at the University of Alberta. Also joining us is Paul McCann, Study Coordinator at the University of Alberta, and Corinne Bees, who has participated in clinical trials, and Don Richards from N2. Just a few housekeeping comments. All participants in today's webinar will be muted except for the panelists. This will help with any background noise and ensure everyone can hear properly. Our panelists will be taking questions at the end of the webinar. If you have a question, you can, through the webinar, use the chat feature of GoToWebinars to send in your questions. You will find this feature to the right of your screen. We will ask your questions to the panelists at the end of the presentation. Please indicate who your question is directed to so we can ensure that the appropriate panelists answer. Should questions arise after the webinar, you can send them to info@huntingtonsociety.ca and we will follow up to ensure your question is answered. I believe we're ready to begin. Thank you again for joining us today. I hope you enjoy our presentation. I will now hand the microphone over to Don Richards from N2.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. Hopefully on your screen you can see today's agenda. Cindy's already offered us the welcome. I'm going to speak briefly about the It Starts With Me initiative, as well as some general information for you on clinical trials. Next up will be Dr. Oksana Sukhawersky, and she'll tell you a bit more about clinical trials, as well as those specific to Huntington's disease. Paul McCann will follow with what to expect at your first study visit. Corinne Bees is here, and she will offer up the perspective of a clinical trial participant. Cindy is going to tell you a bit about genetic discrimination in Canada and some news about that. And then, as Cindy mentioned, we'll take questions and we'll do a bit of a wrap up as well. So to start with, I'd like to tell you a bit about It Starts With Me, and the website address is given to you at the bottom of the screen. This is an initiative that was created by N2, and it really allows you to learn a lot more about clinical trials and clinical research. So I'm going to give you some information from that website to start off with. So first of all, it's important that you know that people who are both healthy or who have an illness can participate in clinical trials. And by participating in a clinical trial, you might help yourself or learn something more about yourself. You might be indirectly helping someone you know and love through learning more about their disease. And you might help to find new treatments. So those might be some of the reasons that you choose to participate. Clinical trials are studies that involve people. And in the clinical trial setting, they're called people who volunteer are called participants, and clinical trials are a type of clinical research. This is carried out to test new treatments before they are put into people on a large scale, to discover how to prevent or diagnose a disease, to learn about how an illness affects people's lives, and to ultimately provide more information about a disease. Before a clinical trial starts, there's a lot of work time and money that's invested up front. So this little chart here basically shows how long it takes from the time compounds or chemicals that are that eventually become, some of them eventually become medications, starts in this drug discovery phase. The preclinical phase is usually where there's some testing done in animals, and then it moves on to clinical trials. And you can see approximately at the bottom of the screen how long each of these different periods takes. So in order for something to be an approved medication, either approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States or Health Canada here in Canada, it's a long process that takes many years, and we start with a number of compounds that are tested at the very beginning, and that's narrowed down to one compound that will become a medication at the end. It's important for you to know that if you volunteer or participate in a clinical trial, there are a number of ways that you are protected, and that happens before the trial starts, as well as throughout the time in which you are in the trial. There's an independent body called the Research Ethics Board that reviews the clinical trial before it starts, and they also periodically review it during the trial itself. There's something called informed consent that Paul will speak to you about a little bit later, and that's making sure that you understand what's expected of you, the process through the trial, and this is something that you would sign before you even start the study. There's oversight of both the scientific and medical aspects of the clinical trial. There are guidelines that the people who run the trial have to follow. They're standardized and they're called good clinical practice guidelines. And then there are obviously regulations that people running the trial must follow that are set up by Health Canada in Canada. And they include inspections and audits by Health Canada of the sites. That it's completely up to you when you decide to be in a clinical trial. So being part of a clinical trial, you have rights. You can decide whether or not you want to be in it. That's your decision. You may withdraw at any time. So you might decide that you'd like to be in a trial, but after a little while, it's simply for whatever reason not for you. And you may withdraw at any time without that affecting your care. And of course, there's confidentiality of all of your information as you participate in a clinical trial. So keep that in mind. It's completely voluntary. It's your own decision to make. Clinical trials can happen in a number of places. You might always think that it happens in a doctor's office or a hospital, but it can happen in community medical centers or nursing stations. It might take place in an academic center or a clinic, and it can even happen in your own home. There are different people that are involved in a clinical trial. The participant is the person who volunteers to be in the study, who might be healthy or might be ill. The principal investigator is in charge of the study itself and all aspects of the study at a site. The study coordinator, again, is someone that Paul will talk about a bit later, and they often interface a lot with the participants. There might be other members of the clinical trial team, such as pharmacists, other doctors, dentists, other people. The sponsor is usually the organization that is behind the study itself, and they may or may not be funding the study, but they're the ones that are interested in really carrying out the study. And then, of course, there's the Research Ethics Board. And as I mentioned before, they're the ones that make sure that the study is run according to how it should be run, and things are done right. Now I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Oksana Sukoworski, and she's going to tell you a bit more about clinical trials, as well as give you some information specific to HD clinical trials. So Dr. Sukoworski, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks, Dawn, for that great overview. So if I could have the next slide, please. So there are two types of clinical studies. The first is a clinical trial or an interventional trial where we give a study participant usually a medication or other types of intervention such as exercise to see whether the person improves or not. These trials, can you go back, please? These trials a lot of times will have a placebo control, and I will go into that a little bit later and explain why that's important. The second type of study is the observational study, where we look in general at how people are doing. For example, what factors may cause progression in a condition, how people, what in general makes people better or worse, or collect biomarkers, which we'll also get into in a little bit. Next slide, please. Next slide. So again, as Dawn mentioned, the study is completely voluntary and does not impact on your care, and so you're free to participate or not participate or withdraw at any time. But the studies that we're doing now will certainly help us get a better understanding of Huntington's disease, what factors may make it better or worse, progression, things like that. And it also is working to developing new treatments and getting better medications and other treatment strategies to help people living with HD. Next slide. So some of the benefits is that, first of all, if it is an interventional study or a clinical study, that you may get access to a new medication that is not available to the general population with HD. And a lot of times when you, although I can't, or no one can promise this, but a lot of the times when you participate in a clinical trial with a new medication, and if it looks promising, then the pharmaceutical company that is sponsoring the trial will allow the participants in the study to continue on that medication as long as it looks promising. So sometimes the participant may get access to a therapeutic medication several years before it is available to other individuals. Also, as part of the study, that you get a lot of things, a lot of investigations that you might not need otherwise. So you might get heart tracings, ECGs, you might get chest x-rays, you might get a lot of blood work. So sometimes we do pick up a medical problem earlier than it would otherwise. So sometimes, for example, we might pick up that a person is at risk for cancer and get them intervention before, or treatment within the regular medical system before you would otherwise. The other thing is that you do get extra time that is spent with the research coordinator, with the physician, so that I think there is, I don't think we can underestimate the sort of the extra support and that a participant in a study gets, being part of the trial, being part of the process of improving treatments for HD. Next slide. Now, if you are in a clinical trial with a new medication, it is very important to recognize that many of these trials are done with placebo, and the reason a placebo or a sugar pill. And so in some of the studies, one of the studies I'm going to be talking about in a minute, Legato, people that participate in the study may get randomized, and it's completely random whether you get a sugar pill or placebo or the actual medications. And generally these studies are done so that neither the participant nor the researchers know who's randomized to what arm of the study. The reason for this is, first of all, that there's a very strong placebo effect. that anyone who participates in a study feels better just because of the extra care they're getting. And we know that that happens in all clinical studies. And so it's very important to counteract for that placebo effect, that we don't think something is working just because the person feels better without the drug actually having the benefit. The other thing that happens is that some medications do cause harm. And there have been a number of drugs where they look very promising and they help the people with a certain condition, but in fact we find out that say 1% of the people get an unacceptable side effect and a serious side effect. So then the study has to be stopped. So first of all, we have to make sure that the medication provides benefit. And secondly, we need to make sure that it doesn't cause harm and that it doesn't cause serious side effects to some of the people that are taking it. Next slide. So this again is just a review of some of the things that were discussed. And first of all medications, new medications have to go through these three phases of studies. Phase 1, it says in the slide that it's healthy volunteers. A lot of times we actually would check for safety in the HD population. We may do it on HD people with HD, not on healthy volunteers. And sometimes, for example, there was an interest in, I think, a drug like lithium, and it caused a lot of people with HD dizziness, and so the study couldn't go on. Phase 2 is done on a larger number of patients, so we want to again confirm that it is safe and get an idea of whether it is effective, but also what doses are effective. So sometimes we may find that a certain dose causes side effects, but a lower dose may work quite well, or the lower dose doesn't cause any benefits. So that's the purpose of a phase 2. And then we go to phase 3, where we have a large study where we want to really get a good idea to confirm that the medication is beneficial and that it doesn't cause side effects. And it's not always 1,000 people. It's sometimes we can do a phase 3 study with 100 people or 200 people. So it just depends on what we're looking for exactly and what we think the findings will be. After phase 3, then we would go to Health Canada or in the US to FDA to try and bring it onto the market if it looks fine. And then after it's more widely available, it's still very important to collect information from all the participants who are on the study medication, or it's not a study medication, and who are on the medication in the real world, whether we pick up any new side effects or any problems that weren't picked up on these earlier studies. Next slide. So now I'd like to move to the clinical trials that are going on in Canada right now. And the next slide shows you where these slides are occurring in Canada. So as you can see that there are a lot of trials going on in Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, and BC. And at the University of Alberta, we're proud to be one of the centers that has a significant research component to our clinical care, as well as the other centers that you see there. Now, this doesn't mean that you're not going to get good clinical care in Saskatchewan or Manitoba or in the Maritimes. All those centers have very good neurologists and geneticists that can provide excellent clinical care. But through M2 and through the Huntington's Society, we are trying to get more of these centers involved in the research studies as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about one observational study and one clinical study. So Enroll HD is the main observational study where we are interested in having any individual or family with HD to participate. This is a worldwide study, as you can see, funded through CHDI, and it is we're very active in Enroll HD in Canada, as well as the US, Australia, and Europe. And so we are following these individuals who are participating in the study to determine what the best clinical care is, to create a biobank, a center of clinical information, as well as information on DNA, on blood, to develop better treatments for Huntington's. So this information goes to a center in Europe, and all researchers who are working in HD have access or can get access to this very large database to do research on. So this is a very valuable center for all of us that we can access to answer specific questions about HD and care for HD patients. Next slide, please. So as you can see, anyone who is affected with HD, who carries the gene expansion for HD, who has a family history of HD but doesn't want to know whether they carry the gene expansion for HD or not. We're also very interested in people from families where they've tested gene negative for HD, so that we can compare people who have the HD gene expansion and not for certain factors. And we're also get information from family controls and caregivers. We appreciate that caregivers also have a number of issues and challenges, and that we are very interested in getting information of how we can improve the care things for caregivers as well. This is a very straightforward yearly visit where you come in once a year, blood is collected, proteins in the blood are collected and sent to Germany, sent to Milan. And then we also do a very detailed clinical assessment looking at quality of life, looking at motor symptoms, cognitive symptoms, and this all goes into a general database. A lot of times the yearly visit coincides with your clinical visit. So for example, in Edmonton, I would see patients twice a year. So once a year, we do the Enroll HD visit along with the clinical visit so that people don't have to travel at other times or use up valuable holiday time or time off work to do the visit. So we try to do everything together. And then the 6-month visit occurs just as a clinical visit. There also are, you can also determine how much of the yearly visit you want to do or not. So we can do a full assessment with blood, or sometimes you can have blood collected. You don't have to have blood collected if you don't want to. And I just received a hot off the press note that so far there are almost 12,000 people enrolled worldwide in Enroll HD. So thank you to all of you who are participating. We really appreciate it, and this is a very important collection of information for us. Next slide. The second study that I'd like to talk about, which is very active right now in Canada, and it is also occurring in the US and in Europe. And this is a study funded by Teva and run through the Huntington Study Group and the European Huntington's Disease Network, where we're looking at a new drug called laquinimod to see whether it slows down progression of symptoms in Huntington's disease. There's a lot of interest right now in the function of the immune system in Huntington's as well as other similar disorders, and we think that the immune system becomes overactive due to the expanded protein, and that the immune system may cause some of the progression we see in this condition. So if we can suppress the immune system, that maybe we can help the symptoms and slow the progression. So this is an investigational drug that is currently being studied in multiple sclerosis, and it looks promising, and we now are fortunate to have the company look at it in Huntington's disease. Next slide. So this is placebo-controlled. So the patients are randomized either into one of 2 doses of laquinimod or or placebo. So you have a 33% chance of getting on placebo, 66% chance of getting onto liquidomide. And we're looking for 400 people in North America and Europe to participate. Next slide, please. And but as for all clinical studies, there are quite strict criteria of who can participate, because we want a very specific population of individuals to participate so we can get a good idea of whether it is beneficial or not. So there you can see the entry criteria, that you have to be fairly, you can't be over the age of 55. You have to have somebody to come with you, because we also want information from the companion or caregiver of how you're doing, because sometimes in these studies you may be developing a side effect that you're not aware of. You can't be taking tetrabenazine or drugs like olanzapine or risperidone. You can't be on chemotherapy or something else that would suppress the immune system and be quite healthy. This is a fairly intensive study, so it is basically a one-year study where individuals will have to come for 9 visits. And we're also using a 3 Tesla MRI. So this is most clinical MRIs use a 1.5 Tesla magnet. So this is a new larger MRI machine that is only used for research purposes, but we really want to get a good idea of the effects on the brain and brain function with the 3 Tesla MRI. And so that's why this study is only, I think, in 3 centers in Canada right now, because it's only the centers that have the 3 Tesla MRI where we can do the study. So we're very interested in anyone across Canada who would like to consider participating in the Legato study. And if you think you may be, then please contact the neurologist or the HD center to see whether you would qualify. Next slide, please. Now, the last thing I'd just like to mention briefly is biomarkers, because that's a term that I think many of you have heard. And right now, we have no good or easy way of measuring progression in HD, say from month to month, and not even from year to year. So the ways we measure progression in HD right now is with basically a clinical exam. So we are so a lot of research are looking for something in the blood or in the spinal fluid that where we can very accurately measure small changes in HD, and in that way we can improve the ways we find medications that help HD and slow down or stop progression. So the study in Europe that is looking at biomarkers, which means small proteins or chemicals, immune factors or the protein Huntington, either in the blood or in the spinal fluid from individuals with HD. And Track HD is occurring in Europe and in Vancouver, where they're also using high definition MRI as well as everything that I mentioned. And there is a new study that is coming to Canada, which is called HD Clarity, which is already in London, where we would take a small sample of the spinal fluid to look for Huntington's markers. So that's where I'd like to stop and turn it over to Paul.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Cindy and Dawn, for inviting me to come and talk today. My name is Paul McCann. I work with Dr. Sikorsky here in Edmonton as the study coordinator, and I've been asked to talk about what to expect at one of your, well, actually your first study visit. Next slide, please. So when I was asked to talk about what to expect at a study visit, I thought maybe it'd be a better question to back up a little bit and ask, well, why are we having the first study visit in the first place? And primarily the main reason to have the first study visit, which is typically known as a screening visit, is to determine whether you're eligible to participate in the study or not. We will do a little bit of due diligence on our own to determine some kind of pre-screening criteria. This might happen at a clinical visit where Dr. Sikorsky or another neurologist might go through your file very quickly while you're there and see some indicators that would suggest that maybe you could participate, and then ask you a few questions further to get some more information or not on whether you'd be eligible. So I think it's a good question to ask why you're having this visit, and then I will get into talking about you can expect at the visit. We can take the next slide, please. So if there's a pre-screening visit, this might typically happen in a doctor's office where you're seeing a doctor for your regular scheduled clinic visit. Some things might stand out at that time that the doctor might believe that, okay, this would be a good participant, or this sounds like it'd be a good person to identify as a potential research subject. At that point, the neurologist may ask you questions, well, what medications are you on right now? Get an update there to just confirm your age, to see if you meet the criteria for this study. There might also be a very brief conversation at that point about the study, where the neurologist might ask you, would you be interested in participating in a research project? There might be some details about the intensity of the project. Would it be logistically possible for that person to come in? In Edmonton here, we serve a large catchment area, so it'd be very difficult for some people maybe to come in all the way from Fort McMurray to Edmonton, which would be a 5-hour drive, and therefore making a commitment for a year study that might involve 9 visits or 10 visits or more might be just logistically impossible for that person. There might also be travel options that are available as part of the research study that the neurologist could discuss with the patient. Say, listen, if we can make accommodations and transportation arrangements, would that make it easy for you to come into the study? So that'd be the pre-screening visit. And initially what we're looking for is just some initial information to be given to the patient, some initial sign of interest on the side of the participant to see if they'd be interested. After that, the study coordinator, myself, or someone else like myself, would be contacting the patient, and that would be the next important step before we would start the screening visit. Could I get the next slide, please? So after the pre-screening visit that might occur in the clinic, the study coordinator would be reaching out to the participant or the potential participant. And the objective here is to give the participant as much information as possible about the research. So in the pre-screening visit, the participant may have shown initial interest. Now we're following up on that initial interest. And really the essential element here is that the participant be informed of every detail about the upcoming visit and what the study might entail. And this is what we refer to as informed consent. Informed consent is very much different from uninformed consent in that the patient does need to be aware of all the information as opposed to going into it at all blind. So what the coordinator will typically do, will get in contact with the participant, send the participant what we refer to as the informed consent form. Now, this is the form that we have to prepare and submit to the Research Ethics Board. Dawn had already talked about the Research Ethics Board, so we have to submit this form to the Research Ethics Board. They have to approve it as being, first of all, legible, first of all, understandable, and it also has to be something that can be read by anybody. So, for example, they set a standard for grade 8 reading level so that most people can understand this, and we don't baffle people with large medical terms or things that maybe they just wouldn't understand. So again, the essential point here is informed consent, and it is really, really important that the patient be informed. In addition to the consent form, we will also typically send information via links to links such as the governmenttrials.com, .gov website, or the Huntington Society has a website as well of clinical trials that we would direct them to, where you can get more information about the study, more details about the drug, for example, more details about the visits, more details about eligibility and that type of thing. We give the participants typically a couple of weeks to digest some of this information, to collect some questions. I always encourage the people that I talk to write down questions for when I'm contacting them again, so they can answer all the questions that they have about the study. So as I said, they're not coming blind into the study, and they know what they're coming into before we see them. Next slide, please. So at the screening visit then, we've done a little bit of a pre-screening. We've sent out the information for the patient, the participant, and we have set up a date on which the participant would come to our clinic or our site. At that point, I will have a copy of the informed consent. I will go through the informed consent with the patient. We'll also discuss any questions that may be still lingering that the participant may have in terms of, well, Paul, how many times am I going to see you? How often am I going to be seeing Dr. Sikorsky? When do I start the study drug? Answer all those questions. And once the participant feels that the questions have been answered to their satisfaction and everything has been covered and they have no further questions, if at that point they want to participate, then we would have them sign the informed consent form. Once the informed consent form is signed, and not until the informed consent form is signed, can we start the actual screening visit. Next slide, please. And here we get to the what you can expect part of the screening visit. So depending on what type of visit it is, Dr. Sikorsky already mentioned that there's two types of studies. There's interventional and observational studies. Interventional studies, again, are where there's some form of treatment involved. Observational is where you're simply collecting information primarily. Depending on the type of study, we will have to go through what we refer to as inclusion and exclusion criteria. And what we're doing when we go through inclusion and exclusion criteria is determining your eligibility for this research study. So things might include, is this person still of the age permitted for this study? For example, if we have someone coming in who is 56 and the cutoff for the study is 55, well, we should have done our due diligence at the pre-screening visit. But if something was missed there, then that person would not be eligible because they're outside the inclusion criteria. Is it disease specific, related to Huntington's with the CAG repeat size? Some studies have to have participants in it that will have a certain CAG repeat size, and they'll have an upper and lower limit of that CAG repeat size. So we'll have to collect that information to see if they're eligible. The neurologist will typically do a physical exam and neurological exam to make sure that there are no other medical conditions or neurological conditions that can account for what we're seeing in clinic and would otherwise exclude the patient or the participant. Might also do vital signs. We do have some studies where hypertension or high blood pressure is an exclusion criteria. We have other studies where heart defects are an exclusion criteria. And these are all primarily safety issues. We do not want to be subjecting participants to a drug that may, in actual fact, jeopardize their health. And the chances of jeopardizing someone's health when they have a health problem already are actually greater than for someone who might be otherwise healthy. So we're determining healthy status. We might also determine cognitive status, or a psychological exam might be part of this study. Mini-mental status exam assesses cognition, as well as the MOCA exam assesses that cognition. There might be questions about suicide or suicidal attempts in the past. So anybody that might be vulnerable would be possibly excluded depending on the medication and the treatment. We'd also assess the medications that the participants are currently taking. And there might be some exclusionary ones, as Dr. Sikorsky said. There might be studies where things like anticonvulsants or antipsychotic medications might be exclusionary. Things like substance abuse might be exclusionary. Usually if it's a concurrent or ongoing substance abuse. Past substance abuse can also be an exclusionary criteria, even though the patient may not have been abusing any alcohol or drugs within the last year, they still might be excluded because of the past history. We'd also collect blood. And the reason we collect blood is to see if there's anything in the blood that might exclude them from the study. There might be an untreated thyroid condition, untreated diabetes that might be needed to be addressed before, that again would make this patient more vulnerable and subsequently might cause more harm to them if they were to be part of the study than if they were not. And there might be some variety of other assessment tools that we would be using that day. But essentially what we're trying to do is eliminate all the exclusionary criteria and get as many of the inclusionary criteria as we can so that the patient can be deemed fit and safe to enter the study. In terms of the study itself, time-wise, it could be a lengthy visit. So be prepared for that. We will always accommodate people here if they want to take breaks. We can stop at any point. We try to go at their pace. We never want our participants to feel like they're rushed. So we can include breaks, but some of these visits could be lengthy, anywhere up to 2 to 5 hours. The setting, as Dawn said earlier, it could happen in a variety of places. It could be a clinic, it could be a research facility, it could be a doctor's office, somewhere in and along that. But this is all the information that the coordinator will be giving you when they talk to you on the phone after the pre-screening visit. Results from things like a physical exam, a neurological exam, the ECG, the heart trace, any of the psychological exams, our blood work, any of those results that come back that show that the participant may have some issues that need to be dealt with. There might be an undisclosed medical health issue that needs to be addressed, psychological issue addressed, would all be addressed by the PI afterwards in follow-up, so that the appropriate follow-up and treatment would be given for someone who has a condition that's identified during the pre-screening that would be exclusionary, but is important for them to have treatment for. That's important to know that we are just not interested in our patients in terms of their involvement with studies, but we're also interested in their health. And if anything stands out as a health deficit, we would refer them on to the appropriate treatment, but they would probably be excluded from that study as well. Or maybe their inclusion into the study would maybe be delayed, and possibly a rescreening visit would happen a number of months down the road when those other issues were addressed and stabilized. Enrollment in the study would only occur after all the assessments are back, and we have received the assessments, and the doctor and the coordinators have reviewed those assessment results, and all the inclusion and exclusion criteria are met. At that point, you would get a follow-up phone call saying, okay, it looks like you're eligible to participate in this study. Thank you very much for coming in for the screening visit. Are you still interested in participating? If the patient still is, at that point, we would get them set up for the next visit, which would be what we refer to as the baseline visit, where if it was a medication treatment, the medication treatment would be dispensed at that visit. The time frame for this may be anywhere from 1 to 6 weeks after the first visit. And of course, it depends on the participant's availability, and we try to accommodate that as best as we can. But it also depends on getting the results back, and sometimes it'll take some time for lab results to come back to us. But as I said, once those results come back, the baseline visit will be started, and then we'd actually start the study at that point with either the treatment, or if it was an observational study, the follow-up. I think that's all I have to say, and thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Paul. We're going to turn it over now to Corinne Bees, and she's going to present some of her experiences as being a clinical trial participant. Corinne?
Morning. Well, after listening to Dr. Sikorsky as well, I felt even more encouraged for participating. I started participating in a clinical trial with my sister, who is now in her 27th year with Huntington disease. I think it was in the early 1980s. We had PET scans at the University of British Columbia. The results for both of us at that time were that there were no signs of the disease, and we could rest for 2 years until the next one. For me, it was the first time since my mother was diagnosed in 1965 that I was free of the constant worry. I continued to participate in research, I'm sure for my own peace of mind, but a very big worry for me was my 2 children. I often looked at them feeling both guilty and terribly worried. In retrospect, I think I felt driven to participate. When I got my genetic test results in late 1990s, I was told I had 36 repeats, and if I lived long enough, I would probably get HD. It is somewhat of limbo land, but my worry mind still thought my son more than my daughter might inherit a larger number of repeats. At this time, my sister had also been diagnosed with having the disease. She has 4 children. Now 2 of her children have also been diagnosed with HD. My interest in research has expanded with strong feelings of hoping that something will result in a treatment for my nieces. One of them has 3 children. One of the questions was what I wish I had known before I started, and I actually can't think of anything that I wish I had known. By this time, I was not nervous about blood tests and needles. Participating in the cohort study and the Enroll HD studies, which I have done since 2011, I have always been a worry for me, but always something I felt I wanted and must do. The worry has been that I will not pass the tests. I will not be able to go fast enough identifying the colors, counting backwards by 7, and my tongue might wiggle too much. I think the biggest worry is walking heel to toe because that is what my sister could not do when she was diagnosed. Most of the time with the doctors, I have felt more anxious and nervous than with the site coordinator, but the staff have always been very friendly. For me, it has always been better to participate rather than be a worried bystander. It gets me outside of myself and settles me down for quite a long time. I think that's more or less a summary of why I participate.
Thank you, Corinne. We really appreciate you sharing your experience with us. Just a couple of follow-up questions. What surprised you the most about participating in a clinical trial?
You know, I'm not sure. I mean, everybody has always been very friendly and very well organized. I think I don't think I had many surprises. I was just glad to be there.
Okay. Can you tell us about your first visit and kind of how you felt?
Well, I remember I felt immense relief after my first visit because I passed the tests. But I also remember that I was very much in need of a coffee and being by myself for a bit afterwards, just to calm down, because I think I didn't realize how anxious I was before. But of course, after it's over, there's an odd experience of almost letdown, but relief as well.
Mm-hmm. What would you recommend to someone? What would you recommend someone do to prepare when they meet with their doctor to talk about participating in a trial?
Well, I was thinking about it, and I thought you need to make sure you get all the details you can. I mean, I'm not sure I knew everything that Dr. Sikorsky talked about, and some of that was a relief. So you want to get all the details, but I don't think you'll really know how anxious you are until it is over.
Fair enough. What advice do you have?
Well, focus on the goal. So the broad good is the reason why you are participating. And to some extent, I'd say you have to try and stay out of competing with yourself and just do the task.
Okay. Thank you very much for sharing your insights and your story. We really appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome.
When introducing this webinar, I mentioned that there were benefits and risks associated with participating in clinical trials. At the Huntington Society of Canada, we want to make sure you understand all of the aspects so that you can make an informed choice. I would therefore like to touch upon genetic discrimination and how this affects all Canadians. Genetic discrimination occurs when people are treated unfairly due to actual or perceived differences in their genetic information. That may cause or increase the risk to develop a disorder or disease. So anyone could have sequences in their DNA that could lead to diseases like cancer or Huntington's, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, diabetes, vision loss, just to name a few. In fact, no one has perfect genes. We all have 30 mutations in our genetic makeup. So this is an issue that actually affects all Canadians. Thousands of genetic tests are available to help Canadians manage their health through early diagnosis, prevention, and treatment. Just 13 short years ago, there were 100 genetic tests. Today, there are over thousands of tests. There are over 33,000 tests, as a matter of fact. Testing comes with an unexpected risk for Canadians, as there are no specific protections against genetic discrimination and no provisions to protect an individual's private, personal, complicated, and often misunderstood genetic information. It is important that we can get genetic testing without fear. We all know that genetic research is very promising and progressing extremely rapidly. Canada has invested billions of dollars to better understand and advance this science. Without this investment, we would not have been able to identify genes which are leading to promising therapies. Without protection, people may be reluctant to come forward for treatments to benefit from early detection or to participate in clinical trials. In the HD community, Dr. Yvonne Bombard's research indicates that 86% of individuals polled are afraid of genetic discrimination and 40% have actually experienced genetic discrimination. Canada is the only G7 country that does not explicitly protect genetic testing information, and people are not stepping forward because of this fear. The Canadian Coalition for Genetic Fairness was created in 2008, and presently it's comprised of 19 organizations, and it's growing rapidly. The Huntington Society of Canada, as many as you may know, has taken the lead in this organization, and Beth Heim-Myers is the chair of the coalition. The coalition has been working with the federal and provincial governments to educate and advocate for genetic information protection. Right now, as we speak, there's a federal Senate bill, Bill S-201, which is an act to prohibit and prevent genetic discrimination, being heard at the House of Commons at the federal level. It is expected to go to the second hour of debate at second reading in late October. The good news is the world is watching Canada. The coalition is to be honored for their work. In October, the American Society of Human Genetics will be honoring Senator James Cowan, a longtime champion of the bill, and Beth Heim-Myers for their work to end genetic discrimination in Canada. The coalition will continue their work to build awareness, educate Canadians so they understand that everyone is at risk, and continue the dialogue with provinces and territories to influence provincial protection of genetic information. The first step is to ensure that there's an overriding law federally to ensure that people are protected. Then the provinces and territories can develop their laws accordingly. That's a very brief overview of genetic discrimination. If you have any specific questions about genetic discrimination, here's the contact information on your screen, or you can email info@huntingtonsociety.ca and we can direct your question to the appropriate person. I am now pleased to hand the microphone back to Dawn so we can address any questions that we have received.
Thanks very much, Cindy. I'm cognizant of people's time. We're close to the 1 p.m. Eastern finish time, but I think it would be nice if we could take a couple of questions. If people do need to drop off the line, we completely can appreciate that. But if you'd like to send questions in, you can go ahead and type them in the questions or chat area, and I will ask some of the panelists for some answers to your questions. As Cindy also indicated, you can email the Huntington Society with any questions that weren't answered during the webinar. And we've also put some information on your screen to help you learn more about clinical trials. So make sure you talk to your healthcare providers about this potentially being an option for you or a family member. We gave the website address www.itstartswithme.ca, which is a website that N2 has developed in conjunction with patients and caregivers. There's lots of good information there. And then, of course, you can visit the Huntington Society website as well. So we'll just take a couple of questions here. One question we have is for Dr. Sukaworski, and that is, how do I get into a clinical trial?
Well, it depends on whether you are affected with HD or not affected. The trials that are currently underway are listed in the presentation, primarily Enroll HD and Legato. So first of all, it depends where you live. And if you live in a center that is participating in the clinical trial, then you should speak to the neurologist or to the social worker from the HD Society to be referred or to find out where to who to call. I think it's probably on the Huntington Society website as well, Cindy.
Yes. Yeah.
So you can just find out where the trial is occurring and contact the individuals at the center. So, for example, in Edmonton, you would be contacting Paul, and Paul will tell you about the study, send you the consent form, etc. If you live, for example, in Manitoba right now, it would be more difficult because there isn't a trial site there. So it sort of really depends where you live. But I think the best thing is to talk to the neurologist who is, if you are affected with HD, to talk to about what trials are going on. Sometimes for some of the trials, we do have the availability to provide funding for transportation to the center. For example, in Legato, we may be able to provide funding for that individual to go to Vancouver or Toronto or Edmonton to participate.
Okay, thanks very much. Another question for Paul, and that is about the informed consent form. There's a question about, what if I don't understand it, and am I allowed to ask any and all questions?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the key there, Don, is the word informed, right? So that would mean that the participant has read the form, understands every aspect of it, what they're getting involved with, and what they're going to be doing throughout the study and how long it is. If they have any questions in any of those regards, absolutely, it is our obligation as the study coordinator to explain it in a way that the participant does not understand anything, but it's also our job to listen to the participant if they have any questions and answer the questions to the participant's satisfaction. Once they're satisfied, then we know that we've answered it correctly.
Okay, great. And maybe
Dawn,
we'll do, yep, go ahead, Cindy.
there's a question here, I think, for Dr. Sikowski. For the clinical trials involving drugs, does the participant have to find out if they are gene positive first before they can participate?
For clinical trials, yes. For example, for Legato, we do need to know that you carry the gene expansion and have very mild symptoms. So I guess in a sense, the gene testing presumably would have been done already because the individual is showing mild symptoms. So for Legato, for an interventional clinical trial, those generally would be done on individuals who already are showing symptoms. So by definition, you would be gene positive.
Okay.
In Enroll, though, it is important to know that you do not need to know whether you are gene positive or not. In Enroll HD, anyone who comes from a family with HD can participate, and you absolutely do not have to find out about your gene status.
Terrific, thank you. We have another question. Are there any clinical trials for residents of Newfoundland? And I can probably answer that question. We're working with Dr. Squarely in Newfoundland to help her establish a clinical trial. So that's in progress. She's part of the HD consortium that we've established to create the National HD Clinical Trial National Strategy. And she's working with a mentor to try to get some studies up and running. Dawn, do you see any more questions
I,
here?
I do. There's one more question. At what phase is the clinical trial for laquinimod, which was discussed?
It is phase 3.
Okay. Um, And there's another question as well, which is more for Cindy and I, which is the slides being made available. So just a reminder that we will be posting the webinar itself, so a video of the webinar, and we could certainly discuss also sharing slides with local chapters. I'll leave that for discussion with Cindy. Cindy,
Um,
there's one more question for you, which is
mhm.
what can we do to help advocate and raise awareness about Bill S-201?
Well, very good question. That we actually have a advocating letter that it's all done online, and you go in and you can formulate your letter and send it to 5 ministers and your local MP. And I'd be happy to share that with you. We're trying to get as many people to fill this out before second reading as possible. I think we're up to 5,000 people who have participated so far. So I think what we'll do is I will send an email to all people who signed up and participated in this webinar. I'll send the link to the slides and to the recording, and also I'll give you the link to that letter if you wanted to participate. It takes about 3 minutes to complete and send to the MPs because it's automated.
Okay. Maybe we'll just take one more question. Um, there is a question about Enroll HD around, is it for any age, basically?
Yeah, so I can take that one. So yes, well, we have consent forms at our site for people under 18 as well as over 18. There's no cutoff from what I can recall in terms of age. We're just not seeing people under 18. So if a site has a consent form or an assent form, is what that's referred to, when someone is under 18, and there's an individual who's under 18 who wants to participate, then that site can see. But they would have to have ethics approval to see someone under 18. It becomes a different area when you're talking about people under 18, because there are different forms to fill in, and it's an assent form that a parent has to agree to. And depending on the age of the child may be able to sign their own, but there's special forms and special ethics permission for under 18. But over 18, I don't think there's a cutoff in terms of an upper limit on age.
Okay. I think in the interest of respecting everyone's time, we're going to wrap up. So I'm going to hand it back to Cindy for a couple of concluding remarks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dawn, and thank you everyone for participating. Just a quick reminder, I will send the recording to everyone. I'll also post it on the Huntington Society of Canada's website, and I know that N2 will also be posting it. And we'll send you a link in case you'd like to share it with family or friends. Tomorrow, or I think either shortly after this webinar or tomorrow, you'll receive the post survey, and we're hoping you'll take a moment to complete it because your answers will provide us with valuable feedback for future presentations. And let us know what problems you experienced trying to log in, because that'll help us down the road. We will now conclude our webinar. Thank you for everyone for taking your time and for your interest. In the Huntington disease community, clinical trials are gaining traction. This is an exciting time for us. As we know, with each trial, we'll learn more and more and get closer to discovering how we can stop this disease. We hope that today's webinar has shed some light on where we are in Canada in regards to HD clinical trials and why they're so important. Thank you.